Yes, hello, good afternoon. This should be the Tuesday after Labor Day. Um, I'm sorry I'm dressed in a t shirt, but actually I recorded this last Friday. But today we're going to talk about Sumerian culture. And to do that, please refer back to your study guide, which, if you don't have it, I have it here right there for you. And you can click on it. And we're about, sorry, I actually got a little bit ahead. We are here with Roman numeral 3. And today we're talking about the region referred to as Sumeria. Many, as you remember in that the film we watched about the Arab marshlands of southern Iraq, some historians believe that this was the so-called Garden of Eden. That was where it originated. At any rate, this part of the world is one of the original cradles of civilization, and from it arises one civilization called the Sumerians. But to help us out, let's look at a map, which is not here. Have no fear, because I have it. And yep, and yes. And there we are. Yes, here's the area we're talking about. Hopefully, you recognize where this is. This is Africa over here. This is the Middle East. This is where Israel now is. But yes, and this area here is referred to in history as the Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent, in other words, the area extending along here. This was some of the earliest areas. This and Egypt's Nile was some of the first areas of civilization. Notice this is the Tigris and Euphrates River, and this area, this valley here, I suppose at one time was very fertile. Today, when you go there, the river still flows through it, and it still supports population. Um, I just don't understand how they call it the Fertile Crescent. All modern pictures I see of it, it's brown looking. But yes, now the region we're talking about is here, Sumer, this area here. Kuwait is another name for it. But yes, Sumer, or the Sumerian civilization. It says there 3200 BC. I do want to direct your vision here, the little town here. For those of you who have gone to Sunday school, read the Old Testament, Abraham, the one who was the father of Judaism and Islam, and by proxy Christianity, was born here. But yes, let's pull up Mr. Notes again. And so, yeah, beginning with Mesopotamia, let us examine the art history of the river valley civilizations of the ancient world. And first, find Mesopotamia on the map, which we just did. It's that green area. This is Mesopotamia, the area surrounding the Tigris and Euphrates River, and this is Sumeria. Okay. All right. What is Sumer? Well, Sumer is that brown area that I just showed you. This is Sumer. Now, what is cuneiform? Cuneiform was one of the earliest forms of writing known to man. It's often referred to as wedge-shaped writings. In fact, let's look and see if Mr. Horton found us some pictures of cuneiform. Open with. Yes, this is an example of cuneiform. And to make cuneiform, the peoples of Sumeria, this is a piece of clay, which, as you can see, has been pieced back together. To make it, they simply used wet clay and then a pointed stick. And because of that, cuneiform is often referred to as wedge-shaped writings. Now, if you look at this, these are more of a pictographical account. But let's go back to it, please. Now, this is cuneiform. Yeah, you can see here by looking at this, these are wedge-shaped writings. You can tell that the person used a pointed stick to make the indentations and the symbols for cuneiform. Okay. So now the next, but now you have an idea of what cuneiform looked like. And by the way, what they would do, they would take a pan or a tray, put wet clay into it, and then make their etchings, and then let it dry in the sun, which gives us the answer to the second question. Why aren't there a lot of examples of cuneiform and Sumerian artifacts left? Answer, because they were mostly made of clay, and clay that had not been fired, hardened. And so weathering, erosion, wind, rain, differences in heat, wear take its toll, and that's why there's not many of them left. Anyway, how do we know about cuneiform? It's actually an interesting question. Cuneiform, for the longest time, cuneiform was just scratchings and meaningless scratchings in stone until something called the Rosetta Stone was found. And the Rosetta Stone was this giant piece of stone, and on it, it had 3 individual messages that were written in cuneiform, and then they believed an identical message was written in Aramaic, which was the language of the Hebrews, and also in ancient Greek. And because of that, and since they knew Greek, since Greek could be transcribed, Aramaic could be transcribed, they could then transcribe the symbols of the ancient ancient Sumerians. Now, the major lasting artistic contribution of the Sumerians is the arch. As it says, without which we would not have such icons of Western culture as Mayor McCheese, Grimace, or major coronary arteriosclerosis. That's me being funny. But no, what is the arch? The arch was one of the first innovations in architecture, and it was accomplished by the Sumerians, which is why I'm teaching this. This is the arch. Yeah. You see, because you wanted to build a structure that was both stable and yet would allow in an entrance like you have here, or a light if it was a window or a door. And so the problem with making a square door, like if you look at your windows or your doors in your house, well, they all have probably a metal brace, a metal piece above the window that keeps the wall from collapsing on it, or at least a strong piece of wood. But the ancient Sumerians didn't have that. Plus, the greater expanse you make it, the weaker it is in the center. But the arch, now look at this drawing, the genius of the arch is that the arch is built, engineered so that the weight is redistributed down into the wall here. And that is the genius of it. And while the Sumerians invented the arch, it will be the Romans that take the arch and run with it and just make it into an art form. They make bridges out of it, aqueducts out of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yes. So the arch. Well, that's why the arch is important, because it can make openings for windows, opening for gates, opening for in the walls, without seriously hampering the structural integrity of the building. In other words, the walls would still be strong. Okay. Now, much of early biblical history can be traced back to that region of the world. I mean, if you read in Genesis, much of Genesis happens in this part of the world that we are talking about here. Much of Genesis, the Old Testament, happens here, and a little bit in Egypt. So, the Garden of Eden was supposed to have been located in the marshlands of the Tigris-Euphrates River. The Marsh Arabs, what we just saw. Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a story. It is a story that came out of Sumerian folklore. It is a story of a giant flood that just washes away everything and leaves very few survivors. To be honest, very similar to the story of Noah and the Ark. In fact, the details are so similar, many historians, scholars think they're the same story, that one gives credence to the other. Abraham, which I talked about, was born in the city of Ur, which I pointed out to you earlier. This is Ur on the Euphrates River, sorry. This is the land of the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Persians, which, if you read in your Old Testament, all these civilizations are mentioned prominently in Judeo-Christian heritage. What country is located there today? Well, Kuwait and Iraq. Notice I said Iraq. Yes. Kuwait and Iraq. So, one of the things that doesn't exist anymore, but there's evidence of it in history, is the so-called Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, let's go back to Mr. Map. Babylon was located right here, where Akkad is. It eventually becomes the city of Babylon. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. 7 wonders of the ancient world. What are the others? Well, the pyramids were one. The Colossus of Rhodes was another, a giant statue that was on the Mediterranean coast that was so large that ships sailed underneath its legs. And yeah, it was called the Colossus of Rhodes. But yeah, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was another. It was this giant tower built by a Sumerian monarch because his wife, who was from the mountains, missed the jungles and vegetation of the mountains, and so the guy builds her an artificial mountain, and with trees, and he actually waters them through using irrigation, pumps water up there using a screw type pump. But yeah, okay. Another invention of this Sumerian culture was pottery. And the Sumerian pottery was sun-dried. That means to harden it, they left it lay out in the sun. And let me direct your attention now to a short video about sun-dried pottery right here. Take it away.
Immediately tells us something about a site. Another crucial observation is how well or what technology was used to make a pot. A piece of pottery can be broadly dated and placed in the world by examining how it was made. Was it constructed like a sculpture from a single or several pieces of clay? Or was it spun on a potter's wheel? Such technology was developed in different parts of the world at different times, and thus can help to date pottery. In other cases, observations as to the very fabric of the pot can be extremely useful. As seen in a previous aspect of archaeology, technique of thermoluminescent dating can help to date a pot using the very fabric of the pot itself, and thus help to date an entire site. In some cases, so-called thin section analysis or ceramic petrology can identify the source of the material which made the pot. By examining a sample of the pot under a high-powered microscope, it is possible to observe the different quantities of geological material in the clay. This acts as a geological fingerprint or postcode, allowing us to identify where this particular mixture is likely to have come from. Occasionally, pottery may still have a residue upon it of what it once contained. And once again, through careful observations and meticulous work, archaeologists are able to reconstruct ancient concoctions from mead to medicines. Some archaeologists study the aftermath of art.
If you didn't catch what he said, by basically finding trace elements in this pottery of what the pottery once contained, you can come up with old recipes. Mead, I hope you all know, is beer. Trust me, since the dawn of mankind, where there's been wheat, barley, and oats, there's been beer. Or medicines or any kind of food concoctions like that.
When pots have been broken or otherwise discarded. You see, often important events will use and consume vast amounts of ceramics and pottery. Curiously, when the remnants of these meetings are reconstructed, sometimes pieces are missing. Sometimes lots of pieces are missing. For some archaeologists, these missing pieces have been taken away as mementos, evidence of the bond created when the pot was whole. And finally, fingerprints, the ubiquitous individual identifier. Some archaeologists try to use fingerprints found on clay pots to trace long-distance trade networks around the world. Still not potty about pottery, eh? Well, here are some excellent examples. When an archaeologist excavates a beaker, this can be extremely useful for interpreting a site. For a start, we know that these beakers spread across Europe at some point during the Bronze Age. Whether this meant a movement of people or simply a movement of an idea, we know that beakers came to define people in life and in the grave. There are beakers of different sizes and different levels of intricacy, but upon some beakers there is residue of a very particular substance. That substance is hemp mixed with a form of ale, a mild hallucinogen possibly used in ceremonies.
Once again, by getting trace elements of what is left on the pot, hemp and ale. Ale is another word for beer.
So, with the mere
Do I have to tell you what hemp is, by the way?
presence of a beaker, we begin to focus in on the world it came from. Stylistically, an Anglo-Saxon pot immediately dates a site in Britain to the post-Roman world. Fragments of this pottery are fairly easily identified, and the quality of their manufacture does vary from place to place. This variation led many researchers to assume that pottery was locally made in kilns of varying quality. However, thin section analysis, or ceramic petrology, examining the very fabric of the pots under a microscope, has brought this assumption into question. Rather than piecemeal domestic production, it seems that much of this pottery was being made by regional specialists in Britain and traded to surrounding areas. When an archaeologist digs a Roman site, they always prepare to gather pottery. Roman excavations frequently unearth so-called Samian ware.
Okay. We're going to leave that because they're beginning to get outside of our realm because they're talking about Roman pottery, which is fired. The Sumerians made sun-dried pottery, meaning that to make it, they took clay, of which, see, that was a thing. From that day to this, the most plentiful natural resource in Sumeria, in Iraq, is not oil, it's clay. The soil is full of it. I mean, actually, to be real honest, the Kentucky soil is full of clay, which is one reason why the Kentucky soil is so humid and it's hard to till because when it rains, it turns into muck, and when it dries, it turns into basically hard as a rock. Also, like I said, it contributes to the high humidity of the state of Kentucky. So, but yeah, sun dried, meaning they use the sun to dry the pottery. Whereas fired pottery, which comes along later on, it's self-explanatory. They developed these kilns, ovens, in which they could take their pottery and heat them to a very high temperature, and that made the pottery more durable. Because one of the big problems with sun-dried pottery, is that sun-dried pottery um, it's more brittle. Sun-dried pottery is more apt to, when you pour something wet in there, a fluid in the liquid, it begins to dissolve the pottery, which is another reason why there's not a lot of Sumerian pottery left. But fired pottery, much longer lasting. The Greeks, by the time we get to the ancient Greeks, which is our next civilization, the Greeks will not only have developed a fired pottery, they will have developed a glaze that is quite decorative, and they learn how to dye it and make it look beautiful. And look at me being funny again. Can fired pottery collect unemployment benefits? I'll let you laugh about that. And so, boys and girls, that ends our short lecture for today. Tomorrow we're going to talk about Egypt, and we're going to talk about it for quite some time. So until now, I will see you then. Well, over here. Yes.